Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm taking a look at Mephisto. Mephisto got his uniform and tier 4 upgrade. It was only a matter of time before he got it, since Sentry got the ball rolling with native tier 3s getting their upgrades ever since he was the first one to get it, and then Null following suit right after that. They continued the pattern of giving upgrades to characters based on release. I'm pretty sure that Sentry was the first native tier 3 to be released, followed by Null and then Mephisto, and in that same order they also upgraded Sentry, Null, and then Mephisto. So if they kind of keep track with this pattern, it's very likely that the next native tier 3 that gets a tier 4 in uniform could be Gore. But since most of these characters have been separated, or these upgrades have been separated by months, it's probably going to be a while till we get that. But till then, I'm obviously going to be reviewing Mephisto completely, not only in his performance in PvE, but also PvP, and looking at all the different CTPs and how they compare to one another across these different modes. I'm pretty sure that most people have heard by now that Mephisto is very strong for PvE. When he released, he was the first native tier 3 character to excel more in PvE than PvP. Both Sentry and Null were situated better for PvP, whereas Mephisto was for PvE. That's still really the case for Mephisto. He is much stronger in PvE and better suited for it than PvP, but I did do a lot of extensive testing for him in PvP to see how he performs at a base level, and as well with a maxed out build at the highest level. If you're familiar with my reviews for native characters, I tend to go all out and try to get them as close to the top 5 to 10 builds as I can to show you what the character is capable of when you max them out. For Mephisto, I spared no expense either. I got him to rank 4, but keep in mind that I only did the elite gear up to level 200 or max after I did the review, so that it can show you what the character can do for most players, since getting the elite gear to level 200 is going to take a lot of time for a lot of players. The only thing that I don't have maxed out is his artifact. I'm actually not even using his artifact, but instead a random one that gives me pierce damage reduction for PvP. If I was to get his artifact, then it would boost my damage even more for both PvE and PvP, but I'm waiting till I can get the 6-star version of that. Other than that, everything else is maxed out, with the other exception also being the Odins. I only have them up to the engraved level and not the glory level, because that is just kind of unrealistic. It'll take people forever to do that, including myself. In terms of the build that I'm using for Mephisto, I ultimately ended up going with a Brilliant Conquest for PvP, but for the different content that I'm testing, I mention in a caption the build that I'm using to show you how the character performs. So the first thing that I tested in PvE was how Mephisto performed without a damage proc and without his uniform upgrade at level 70. So I went to stage 39 of Null without using a leadership or supports, and I was able to complete this stage with about a minute and 15 seconds remaining. To get an idea of how much of an improvement the uniform provides, I then did the exact same test, this time equipping the uniform at the mythic level or maxed out, and I was able to complete the exact same stage about a minute and 20 seconds faster. So the uniform alone just provides a massive improvement, also because it is his first uniform, so he's gaining a lot of base stats from that uniform being upgraded to max. I try to always test character upgrades on Null, going from stages 29 to 34, sometimes higher or lower depending on the restriction, just to get an idea of how the character performs in PvE and get that base level of performance. Usually the thing I'm looking for is if the character can complete the stage without a leadership or supports, with roughly around anywhere from a minute and 30 seconds remaining to a little bit more than that, then I know that the character is strong for PvE. And you can see that obviously Mephisto completed stage 39, which is even higher with even more time remaining, so he at a base level is very strong for PvE. He basically completes that base test about a minute faster than the other characters I've tested at a higher stage, and then with the level 80 upgrade, he's able to shave off another minute and 15 seconds from the clear time, finishing with roughly around 3 minutes and 45 seconds left. Because I need a better metric to compare his performance when he goes from level 80 to tier 4, I decided to go to a stage 39 of Kang, but this time I did end up using supports just to see how he would perform, and surprisingly enough, I was actually almost able, or basically able, to complete the stage without a damage proc, which is very impressive considering that I do this test with characters who are at tier 4 and they oftentimes can't complete the stage, but Mephisto is doing it basically at level 80 and not even at tier 4 yet. The rotation that I used for the PvE testing in this video is to use the second skill at the start and then never use it again, because that is what transforms him into the kind of PvE version that has all of the effects that you want. From there, the rotation that I used was to do a 3 very slight delay cancel into a 1, and again with a very slight delay cancel into a 5, and then cancel 4. You can almost do a 3 cancel 1 cancel, it's just that you have to delay it a very slight amount so you don't miss the hits from those skills. I'm usually just spamming these skills after that first rotation to fill up the tier 3 and when I get it the tier 4 faster, and oftentimes just using that rotation when it's naturally available off the cooldowns, frequently finishing with the 3rd skill or the 4th skill when it isn't. This probably isn't the most ideal rotation, but that is the one that I went with, and it might be the reason why my PvE performance might not be as kind of up there or kind of as good as some people that might have a lesser build. But regardless, that is the one that I went with for this video, and you can see how it performs throughout. When you have your tier 3 filled up, you want to use that at the start. You can basically instant cancel that. And if you also have the character at tier 4 and have that available, make sure to use that at the start as well, so you can get the damage burst and striker damage from that, and then fill it up naturally as you fill up the tier 3 with the skill rotation. Upgrading Mephisto from level 70 all the way to tier 4 isn't going to be cheap because he is obviously a native tier 3 character and is more expensive. For me, it cost around 9.5 thousand carbonadium and a little bit over 7.5 thousand Soul of the Faltine, as well as 115 million gold, using that 10% method to get his potential from 70 all the way to 80. Just as a note, like the other native tier 3 characters, you have the option of either using biometrics or CCF to upgrade the character's levels. I would advise that you do use CCF if you are kind of a player that isn't very new, because you'll have a lot of CCF and it is a lot cheaper to use the CCF than using the bios. I think the bios will just end up being thousands to get his level from 70 to 80, whereas using the CCF, it's somewhere in the hundreds, if not less than 1,000. The stat bump that Mephisto gets for his tier 4 isn't really anything too special. He does gain a pretty good amount of energy attack, which is very nice, but his HP doesn't really increase that drastically. The main reason for this is because the character is a native tier 3, he already has a very high amount of base stats as is, so he's not going to get anything too crazy because he's already at a very high level of stats to begin with. Mephisto's tier 4 skill is good. It gives him a little bit of HP, attack increase, and damage output when the skill is used. I can see why the devs went with this because the character is more situated for PvE, even though they did try to make him a little bit of a hybrid, but it would have been really nice if they also added in a little bit of healing on there, despite the fact that Mephisto's tier 4 is more loaded than the other characters like Null and Sentry. Null and Sentry both have healing on their tier 4s, which definitely helps a lot when they actually reach the skill to keep them alive. That is one of the things that Mephisto kind of needs, even though they did give him that HP increase. The healing would have really helped even if it was a small amount. At the max level, the tier 4 provides a 50% HP increase, a 100% attack increase that goes up by 25% every second, and 1,334 additional flame damage tacked on when the skill is used. In terms of the strikers, just use the best one that's available to you. You end up gaining more damage output in the long fights by using a good striker than trying to max out the tier 4 skill. So the top options, I believe, for most players are going to be ones like Ghost Rider, Thor, Black Widow, and so on. For the PvP striker, it's basically the same thing. You just want to use the most ideal one that has iframe ignore and all the other effects like penetration and a damage proc on the skill. So ones like that would be for Wolverine, Carnage, Spider-Man, Ghost Rider as well. But if you do want to match the instinct type as well, I believe that the most ideal option for Mephisto would be Shala Bal, because she has all of those effects for the most part and also has the matching instinct. Since I basically completed this fight with no time remaining when he was at level 80, there was only about a half health bar left. The improvement that the tier 4 provides is roughly around 1 minute and 55 seconds faster than before. No surprise that Mephisto is meta in ABX and ABL because of his very high hit count and because of the score that he can yield. He's primarily going to be used for the Universal Villain Day in ABX and the Universal Male Day in ABL, though he's also used for the No Restriction Day because he ends up dealing the most score out of any other character in the game now. He has all of the cancel effects for all the different seasons, if I'm not mistaken. If you don't have his uniform though, he is missing the Fracture, but you're not really going to be using Mephisto without his uniform for the Blast Villain Day because he doesn't score as much as Doctor Strange. Regardless, you can see that at level 70 I was able to score around 9.5 million with that particular setup for that Blast Villain Day. And to get a direct comparison how much of an improvement the uniform provides, I was able to increase the score by around 2 million just by equipping that. At level 80 I did the same test and was able to improve the score by roughly about 1 million, but it could also be that I just ended up playing better and ended up scoring higher as a result. The tier 4 definitely provides a massive improvement to his score, and I went from around 12.8 million at level 80 to a little over 15 million at tier 4, providing just a bit over a 2 million point increase. Keep in mind that all the testing I've showed so far is Mephisto without a damage proc at all, so now I'm going to be looking at how much of an improvement specific CTPs provide to him, both in World Boss Legend as well as in ABX and ABL. So the first one that I tested was a Mighty CTP of Rage. With that, I was able to complete the same stage I did before without a damage proc, about 1 minute and 15 seconds faster, finishing with roughly around 3 minutes and 10 seconds remaining. With the Mighty competition, I was able to complete this same stage about 40 seconds slower, which was a little bit surprising because I considered the competition would probably be an improvement since Mephisto doesn't have guaranteed crit, but I am not entirely sure if it's also due to the fact of how I'm doing the rotation. That could be a factor of why the competition was a little bit slower in World Boss Legend, but that is the result that I got. At the Brilliant level, I finished the stage about 3 seconds slower, which obviously doesn't make sense, but it can be a factor of this particular fight with the different kind of animations and stuff slowing you down more than the others, and because of my rotation. If I had to guess, it would probably be around a 30-second difference, if not more, from the Mighty Rage going up to the Brilliant Rage. Because Mephisto is an elemental character, I also decided to test out a Brilliant Judgment, and he ended up clearing this stage the fastest out of the other builds that I tested, finishing with around 3 minutes and 40 seconds remaining, or roughly about 30 seconds faster than the other builds. It's also worth noting that this CTP might not be the best option for you because it just depends on the supports and the build that you have. I obviously didn't have the artifact, so I don't have that flame damage, and I'm not using supports that gave flame damage because both of those would probably increase his elemental damage so high up that he might hit that kind of soft cap and not make the Brilliant Judgment's proc of giving that elemental damage as impactful as maybe the other CTPs could end up being with that particular setup. At the Brilliant level, the competition performed about 10 seconds faster. It would probably be even more than that depending on the rotation and the animations that I faced in this particular fight, but the point is that it was still slower than the Brilliant Rage and the Brilliant Judgment for this particular comparison. Because Mephisto is meta for ABX and ABL, and because the competition, spoiler alert, ends up performing a little bit better in things like ABL, I decided to further test that out if someone decides to go with that build to see how he would perform in the higher stages of World Boss Legend that I had access to. The highest stage that I had access to was level 55 of the Ebony Maw one, and I was previously stuck on this stage even though I had an additional 5% Pierce using Doctor Strange. I just couldn't make it in time. Pretty sure if I had the additional 10% from the Team Up collection, I probably would, but Mephisto was able to breeze through this even with a non-ideal run with well over a minute remaining. On the ABX side, with a Mighty Rage, I was able to score around 17.2 million, which is roughly about a 2 million increase from not using a damage proc at all. When I tested the Mighty Competition, I was able to get around 16.5 million, which is about 500 to 700,000 less than the Mighty Rage, but again, that could also be attributed to the rotations and things not being ideal. They're likely probably a little bit closer than that, but that is what I ended up seeing, that the Mighty Competition was just a little bit behind the Mighty Rage for ABX. At the Brilliant level of Rage, I decided to test out Mephisto without a uniform to see if he was viable for the Blast Villain Day in ABX, but he wasn't really able to score that much even with a tier 4. I was barely able to hit almost 15 million with him, which isn't really going to compete because Doctor Strange with the zombie uniform can easily outscore this. With the Brilliant version of the Rage and the uniform, I was able to improve his score by around 300,000, which again I'm pretty sure would be even more than that with a more refined rotation. I also tested out the Brilliant Judgment in ABX since it seems to have less of an impact than it does in ABL, where the Brilliant Judgment just isn't as good, and I was able to score around 16.8 million, which was roughly around the same as the Mighty Rage if I'm not mistaken. So if you are going with the Brilliant Judgment option, it does seem to be decent in ABX at the very least, but won't score as much as a Brilliant Rage or even a Brilliant Competition, as you'll see in the next clip. With the Brilliant Competition, I was able to score somewhere around 17.3 million, almost 17.4 million, so it is very close to the Brilliant Rage, but of the multiple tests I did, it still ended up performing a little bit less than the Brilliant Rage, so that is something to keep in mind if you're competing for high scores in ABX. I might also be mistaken because a lot of these scores have to be done pretty much a lot of times to get something very conclusive, and it differs greatly between rotations because it is a 3-minute long fight that you're scoring up. But that is, again, the result that I got from comparing these, that the Brilliant Rage seemed to outperform the Brilliant Judgment, obviously, and the Brilliant Competition by just a little bit, even though it was very close. I obviously wasn't using the most ideal supports for the tests that I did. I was just continuing the same setup that I had before. If I did a more ideal setup and to go with the no restrictions day, I believe, I would use Satana as the leadership and Ghost Panther as the support, but I still probably don't have the most ideal setup because of the insight and liberation options that I have equipped. But with this setup, I was able to score somewhere around 17.6 million. If I had the most ideal one, I would probably easily score above 18 million with the Brilliant Competition, and possibly a little bit more than that with the Brilliant Rage if my tests were accurate. On the ABL side, using a Mighty CTP of Rage and a support setup that matches the universal male restriction, I was able to score around 14.6 million. The Mighty Competition seemed to be an improvement, going up to 15 million or about a 400,000 point increase. At the Brilliant level, I tested out Mephisto for the Blast Villain restriction setup using those supports, but again, he doesn't really compare to Zombie Strange, as I was only able to score around 11 million, whereas Zombie Strange can easily score above 13 million or even 15 million or more with a good setup and rotation. With the uniform equipped, however, and comparing directly to the Mighty Rage, I was able to improve my score by roughly 1 million. For those wondering how the Brilliant Judgment compares, because it did well in World Boss Legend and decent in ABX, it just really isn't a good option in ABL, and I was only able to score close to 14 million with it, which was actually worse than the Mighty Rage and the Mighty Competition. It's not really a surprise that the Brilliant Competition was the most ideal for ABL. I was able to score about 1 million more than the Mighty Competition and roughly about 500,000 more than the Brilliant Rage. Besides these PvE modes, Mephisto isn't really going to be that great in auto modes in PvE because his AI just doesn't use the second skill, which ironically makes him good for PvP as the hybrid, but not good for PvE. So if you're using him for auto modes, like things like Dispatch or things like Dimension Rifts, he's not really going to be the most ideal option there because he'll just stay in his kind of PvP mode and not perform the most ideal rotation. But at things like Multiverse Invasion or whatever it's called, you can also play manually, so if you do play that manually, you can get a lot of score there. Outside of those modes, one of the other PvE modes that Mephisto will likely be meta in is for zombie survival on the weeks where the second skill isn't disabled. When that is disabled, you can't really switch to the PvE version of him, so you're probably going to struggle, but in all other weeks where that isn't disabled, then he's likely going to be meta because he deals a ton of damage and you can do some of the highest stages with him. He's particularly going to be good in the weeks where you can use his tier 3 skill and his 5th skill because that gives you damage accumulation, but you can see here that even on the weeks where the 5th skill is disabled and even the tier 4 skill is disabled, I'm almost able to do stage 79 because one of the benefits for him is that he is an elemental character, so you can pair him up with Storm that does a ton of damage even as a support or not, and you can pair him with some of the best villain supports in the game. Usually for the other native tier 3 characters, the PvE part is the part that isn't really that interesting, and the PvP part is the one that is. But for Mephisto, it might kind of be the opposite, though I still think the PvP side is interesting nevertheless. Because of the way Mephisto's kit is set up, he won't be as strong in PvP as he is in PvE, since the devs clearly intended for him to be PvE meta and just be functional in PvP, but I wanted to see how far he could go, so the first thing I did was to equip a Mighty Conquest and just test him out at level 70 to see if he could take out any of the top metas. He was successfully able to take out the first life of Sentry, as well as take out Wolverine completely, and zero the first health bar or life of Null. At level 80, I was able to take out both lives of tier 4 Sentry and take out the first health bar of Wolverine in the same fight. Even though Mephisto is missing some of the other effects that the top 2 PvP metas have, Sentry and Null, he's still able to function at a pretty high level. He's missing things like remove all debuffs off his iframe ignore, as well as immunity to debuffs for a certain duration, and having a barrier shield. At tier 4, I'm basically able to take out this entire team, but it isn't always consistent and entirely realistic because the team that I'm facing doesn't have any supports, and usually the top meta characters in a PvP team always have one support on them. And on top of that, I also have to use 2 supports to be able to take out the top metas, because for Mephisto, if you want him to function at a high level versus the top 5 PvP metas, characters like Sentry, Null, Wolverine, Silver Surfer, and Adam Warlock, you absolutely need at least 1 support, or possibly even 2 to take out their lives entirely. I purposefully didn't use the best supports available to show you that he can still function even if you're not completely decking him out, but you can see in the next test that I only used 1 support to show you the difference in the performance. In this test, I swapped out Beast for Hulkbuster, which obviously doesn't give Mephisto support, and I wasn't able to win, but pretty much made it right to the end, taking out Null's first life and dying on his second. I'm not entirely sure where Mephisto falls in the PvP rankings, but I would say that given his cost and performance, a safe guess would be somewhere around top 5 or 6. The top 2 are obviously Sentry and Null, with the ones right after that in no particular order being Wolverine, Silver Surfer, and Adam Warlock. I would say that Mephisto is somewhere after that. He could potentially be a little bit ahead of characters like Silver Surfer or maybe Adam Warlock or Wolverine in some cases, but because he is such an expensive character and his performance doesn't really just definitively exceed them, I would say that it's a safer bet to put him in 6th place. The other factor for placing him around top 6 or potentially even lower than that is that other weaker native characters can potentially take him out, whereas usually for the top 5 PvP metas, they're very resilient and tough to take down by other characters. So for most other people, it might be 6 or even lower of a ranking, especially if they're building him for PvE and as kind of a full hybrid. There's 2 real things holding Mephisto back from being in the top 3 PvP meta that the devs could change to make him substantially stronger and a just outright true hybrid, where depending on the build that you use, he can be at the very top of the PvE meta or at the very top of the PvP meta. The first is the cooldown on the iframe ignore skill. It's on a 14-second cooldown, and for most other top PvP characters, they usually have a much shorter cooldown. Sentry and Null both have an 8-second cooldown on their iframe ignore. Adam Warlock has an 11-second cooldown, and then characters like Silver Surfer have a little bit longer of a cooldown. I believe it's somewhere around 15 seconds, but Silver Surfer also does damage just by standing around, so that kind of mitigates that higher cooldown. And for characters like Wolverine, he has the highest, I believe, 16 seconds on his iframe ignore, but he is also very tanky because he's constantly hiding in his own iframes and has that passive healing and high damage reduction. And when the iframe ignore skill activates, he pretty much just takes out everyone because it has a damage proc on it and stacked stats. These cooldown times are obviously halved when you have the max cooldown reduction, but for Mephisto being a native tier 3, he seems to have the highest cooldown on his iframe ignore, considering that he doesn't have other effects like reflect or very high survivability, and his iframe ignore skill isn't really stacked with effects like the other characters. If the cooldown on his iframe ignore was reduced by anywhere from 2 to 4 seconds, he would easily be able to compete even more so in the top 5 PvP rankings, if not higher than that. The main benefit is that you can stack your key effects more often, but more importantly, actually be able to attack and take out the opponent before they do the same to you. The other factor that keeps Mephisto from being at the very top of the PvP meta is to do with his survivability, and more specifically to do with the interaction of how his healing works on his 4th skill, or really doesn't work. For pretty much all of the top PvP characters who don't rely on passive healing like Wolverine, they instead rely on active healing, so they get a flat percent-based healing every time they activate a skill. And oftentimes the healing is associated with the iframe ignore skill, which is on a short cooldown, which is the reason why they are so tanky, because they can constantly just spam that skill and instantly heal up. For Mephisto, however, he does have the healing on his iframe ignore skill, which is obviously good, but the healing isn't a flat percent base that instantly activates. What happens instead is that he gains healing every second, and for the amount of damage that he takes, that healing accumulates and goes up, which seemingly would be better than just a flat percent base, since you can get a ton of healing this way, but the issue is that this type of healing doesn't scale up with recovery rate. I tested this out when Jean Grey came out, or the Dark Phoenix skin, and the recovery rate stat doesn't really impact the healing that you get from this. So this is one issue, but the bigger issue is that instead of the character just healing quickly immediately from that flat percent based healing, the character instead gets a healing buff. So that buff goes in those little icons at the top and will kind of accumulate or go up and just stay there for about 5 seconds or so. The main problem with this is that pretty much all of the top PvP characters in the game now can remove active buffs, either through that effect or through incapacitation, which means that oftentimes Mephisto is just left without any healing at all. The easiest way to fix this is to give a flat percent based healing on top of the accumulated healing that he gets. This way he can instantly activate the shorter cooldown iframe ignore skill and get that instant healing, as well as have that buff up whenever it's active there. Or if they want to really make him stronger, they can give him immunity to incapacitation or cancel when the 4th or 5th skill is used, so that that healing accumulation can still be there and his survivability can stay intact. If these two main changes are made, lowering the cooldown on the iframe ignore skill and adding a flat percent based heal with the accumulated healing, then the character could function at the top 3 level. Outside of that, if they wanted to guarantee that he was strong, they could also add in the immunity to debuff and the debuff cleanse on the same skill like they have with characters like Sentry and Null. In terms of the PvP build options, I'm showcasing them from worst performing to best performing. I tested out the Mighty versions, but decided to show the Brilliant versions because the performance was very similar. The Brilliant competition was the worst performing one for a specific PvP build, but I included it for those people that want to use him as a hybrid. He was only able to take out 1 life of Sentry, but was able to take out 2 lives of Silver Surfer, though I doubt that he can do that consistently. I didn't test out a Judgment or a Rage, but I would assume that the Judgment would essentially have the same kind of performance as a competition because the proc conditions are the same. The Rage would slightly be worse in PvP because the proc conditions are based off crits, and those don't happen as frequently as the other two. To get a better perspective of how these CTPs function, I decided to test the best case and worst case of them to get kind of an average of their performance. The CTP of Greed was an improvement over the Competition and likely the Judgment and Rage because it has the guard break immunity, and in the best case I was able to take out both lives of Sentry and actually take out Wolverine completely even after I died because of all of the lingering pulls of damage that Mephisto casts. In the worst case scenario, he was only able to take out one life of Sentry, essentially making it function similar to the Brilliant Competition, but with the downside being that you don't have the same performance benefit in PvE. So if you are considering a Brilliant Greed, there is the RNG that it doesn't really do that much, and you might benefit more from just going a hybrid option and getting the benefits obviously in PvE. Versus a Silver Surfer, however, the CTP basically functioned again similar to the Competition. I didn't really make it past Sentry's first life with that build. Of the CTPs I tested, it seems that the survivability based ones are the ones that make Mephisto excel the most in PvP as a dedicated PvP character. So you kind of have to ditch the hybrid if you really want to make him powerful for PvP. And the lower end of the options that I tested was the Brilliant Regen. The Brilliant Regen only provides survivability through that top proc, the penetration proc, and that is really RNG heavy. You don't get any super guard break immunity from it, so you're just relying on that actually getting a good proc off of it. Otherwise, you're not really going to get much from it. The other issue with the Brilliant Regen is that the recovery rate that you get from it doesn't synergize with the healing accumulation, meaning that it doesn't really do anything for his healing, so you're basically just getting the health shield from the regen outside of that. With the Brilliant Regen, I was able to, in the best case, go down to the first life of Null, but in the worst case, I wasn't able to take out Wolverine, so basically just the 2 lives of Sentry. Versus Reflect characters like Surfer, I was able to take out both lives, but did end up dying to Sentry right after that. The regen didn't really protect much against the Reflect from Surfer, even though it doesn't provide any offense capabilities. The survivability that it provides isn't enough to mitigate the Reflect damage. The Brilliant Authority proved to be an improvement over the Brilliant Regen. In the best case scenario, I was able to get down to the second life of Null, and in the worst case scenario, I was able to get down to the second life of Wolverine, which was a direct improvement from the Brilliant Regen not being able to reach those same checkpoints. With the Brilliant Authority, you have that reserve invincibility, even though Mephisto opens with the 4th skill that has invincibility. If you get under 50% health, you have that backup invincible from the Authority. You also gain some additional damage from the damage accumulation, and because Mephisto has 40% damage reduction passively, if you get lucky enough to get 60% from the top proc of the Steel Authority, you gain about 5 seconds of pseudo immortality, which really helps out with his survivability. The other benefit is that you have super guard break immunity, which means that you can more reliably go into your skills without being locked down. But versus Reflect characters, the performance was pretty much the same as the other CTPs. I ended up taking out both lives of Surfer, but ended up dying to Sentry right after that. If you've been noticing through the clips so far, Mephisto still is susceptible to Reflect damage because he has so many lingering attacks, and because Reflect just does so much damage back. Even though he has that Reflect damage reduction, he can still end up dying from Reflect damage. And someone asked me whether you can stack up the Reflect damage reduction. You can stack it up. You can add in characters like America Chavez and Black Knight like I did in this particular test, but it doesn't work the way that you would think. It's not additive. It doesn't kind of reach 100% where you get complete immunity. It functions a little bit different, has kind of diminishing returns, so it won't give you that full immunity. You would still have to use something like a CTP of Conquest to get that full immunity and not be susceptible to Reflect damage. Surprisingly enough, the Refinement did end up performing a little bit better than the Authority. I was able to reach the first life of Null instead of the second life, which I guess is a little bit worse in that case. But in the best case, I was able to reach that, and in the worst case, I was still able to reach the first life of Null, whereas for the Authority, Mephisto pretty much ended up dying versus Wolverine and didn't get to the first life of Null. This CTP's survivability is a little bit more RNG because you don't have guard break immunity. You are susceptible to being locked down before the top proc activates, and the CTP of Authority is likely a little bit more consistent, but the Refinement was able to perform better at the peak level. The Refinement basically provides the main benefits that Mephisto is lacking in his kit due to the way his healing works. He obviously sometimes doesn't get it, so the refinement actually provides that healing from the bottom proc as well as a shield, which he doesn't have, and obviously provides that mega boost of healing when the top proc activates, and gives him that super guard break immunity to allow him to just rotate through his skills as well. The refinement still ended up performing the same versus reflect characters as the other CTPs. Mephisto was able to take out both lives of Surfer, but ended up dying to Sentry right after, even though he's likely to take less damage because he is dealing less damage with the refinement not having any kind of offensive improvements. The fight is also longer, so he is taking more reflect damage in the long run too. Unsurprisingly, the Brilliant Conquest was the best performing CTP option. In the worst case scenario, I was able to get down to the last life of Null in that first test I had with Sentry and Wolverine. But versus the other fight, the reflect characters like Surfer, I was actually able to take out Surfer without much trouble, and then had enough to take out both Sentry and reach the last life of Null, meaning that this obviously was the best performing CTP because on the low and high end it was able to go the furthest out of these characters on the opponent team. Keep in mind that all of that PvP testing for the CTPs was done with just one other average support. Once you add in 2 strong supports, the character does become reliable in taking out at least one life of any of the top 5 PvP metas, if not both of them. You can see that in this test specifically, I was able to take out this entire team with Mephisto and using Beast and Colossus support. The Conquest just provides a ton of effects that pretty much all PvP characters need. The wall effect gives him a bunch of survivability with that damage reduction. He also gains a little bit of healing. He gains the HP increase, which still helps out with his healing, even though it's not consistent. The recovery rate doesn't really do much, but the damage increase that you gain from the top proc of the Conquest CTP also really helps because you can consistently take out the opponents and avoid taking damage that way too. And obviously you saw from the last clip that the Brilliant Conquest is the most consistent one to help protect against reflect characters, and you obviously also get the added benefit of getting that super guard break immunity so the character can rotate through his skills more often to reach the tier 3 and tier 4 skill. If you're thinking that I cherry picked opponents or didn't choose the right ones to showcase Mephisto's kind of weaknesses, that he isn't really that great, I also went up versus opponents that were in Challenger. The ones before were all in Vibranium, and the ones in Challenger also even had buffs. The buff that I have doesn't even apply to Mephisto, and the characters that they have in Challenger also had supports, so it shows that the character Mephisto can take out opponents or the top 5 PvP metas even if they have supports. Even with all that, I wouldn't necessarily recommend using Mephisto in Timeline unless certain bans are in place. Characters like Sentry and Null will still outperform him, especially if they have double supports or they have really strong supports like Null having Agent Venom. Regardless, I did do this test with the opponent team being a Challenger, having all of those top buffs that you get in Challenger as well as Agent Venom, and I was still able to take out the first life of Null, even though I wasn't able to win completely. If you're wondering why I'm using these specific supports and not using, for example, Shuri, Baku, or maybe Ebony Maw instead of Colossus to gain that damage increase as well as the damage reduction, I just wanted to keep the supports consistent. This is the setup that basically provided with the most survivability. You might be wondering why I'm using Beast instead of ones that give damage reduction. The reason that I go with Beast is because he gives a ton of HP, and I also have the Liberation CTP on him, which gives an additional amount of HP on top of that. And the best thing that you can do for Mephisto to increase his survivability just generally versus any kind of opponent is to increase his HP, because the recovery rate doesn't affect his healing. The higher you can get the HP, the more you can kind of increase the overall healing from that skill. Because Timeline is so competitive with the top 5 PvP characters, it's very difficult to say whether Mephisto will see usage there, but if the bans align where characters like Sentry or Null are banned, then Mephisto could very well be the top option there. If you're wondering how to use him on manual play, at the very start you basically just want to move around and avoid damage. He has enough HP to be able to survive most attacks. And then versus most opponents, you want to try and spam the 3rd and 5th skill as fast as possible so you can get those damage effects on the ground, so that once you go into your 4th skill, you have that Eye from Ignore. all of those effects will hit the opponent. The other benefit is that by being able to spam these skills, you fill up your tier 3 and tier 4 faster, which will help manage kind of your survival versus very strong characters, because you can use that tier 3 skill to give you a little bit of survival as well as lingering damage even if you do end up dying. Countering Mephisto isn't really too difficult if you have access to characters like Sentry or Null. Mephisto's 4th skill has a limited range. That is also another reason why he isn't as good as Sentry and Null, because their iframe ignores pretty much track the opponent down and they can't really dodge it too often or as easily. So you basically dodge the 4th skill and then you just use your own iframe ignore skill that will remove the healing from Mephisto as well as lock him down, and that's when you can do a ton of damage to basically take out both of his lives. Even though Mephisto's value in timeline may be limited, and I'm not entirely sure if that's a Mephisto issue, more so a timeline issue, because the banning there is terrible. It usually just bans one character and then the other top 5 characters are just there to fill the void. It isn't banned nearly as well enough as it should be to allow more characters to basically shine in it. Regardless, even though his value may be limited in timeline, his performance and value in other PvP modes is undeniable, especially if you have a dedicated PvP build. He's basically able to take out the first life of every PvP meta in the game, whether you have a dedicated PvP build or a PvE one. However, if you do have a dedicated PvP build, he is able to at least more consistently take out both lives of those PvP characters. Might not be very consistent because of the issues that he faces with his healing and survivability, but he is at times able to take out full teams, especially if you add in supports to your own team. You can see from the tests so far that I'm able to take out characters like Doom, Adam Warlock, Silver Surfer, and even take out the first life of Null and Carnage and be able to clean up that team by using a reliable counter afterwards, which would be magic. Because Mephisto was so close to fully beating that Surfer and Null Carnage team in the previous clip, I decided to find another team with the exact kind of same setup, and this time around I was actually able to win entirely. One of the things that I find benefits Mephisto in Alliance Conquest the most is to have one character that can take aggro or kind of just take the focus off of Mephisto so that his healing can stay intact and he doesn't have those effects removed. If there's a tanky character like that, Mephisto does perform a lot better. And surprisingly enough, Beast is very tanky and also provides support to Mephisto, so it is actually a pretty good matchup for him. Although Mephisto is capable of fully taking out characters like Adam Warlock, Surfer, and even Null, he will end up struggling even more so versus characters like Sentry and Wolverine, because they immediately open with their iframe ignore skill, they have super guard break to lock down Mephisto, and they have that incapacitation effect as well as remove active buffs to remove his healing. So one of the things that you can do to kind of make that fight easier is to use an awakened character at the beginning that has revive to be able to kind of just burn through their first life or make that fight easier. In this case, I ended up using Rachel to try to burn through Wolverine's first life and Sentry's, but only ended up burning through Wolverine's. Mephisto was able to fully take out Sentry by himself. I don't really have too many counters that I could test versus Mephisto because I didn't really find too many in the wild that were with PvP builds, but one of the things you can do is use a character that has super guard break lockdown. You can use characters that open with iframe ignore and have incapacitation or remove active buffs, and reflect characters. So usually the top 10 PvP characters are able to take him out, but if the opponent Mephisto isn't at tier 4 and obviously doesn't have a PvP build, then you can use other strong or decent PvP characters to take out both of his lives. The most value I've found for Mephisto in PvP so far is in Team Battle Arena. Now you can have another character that is capable of taking out ones like Sentry or Null, or has the chance to be able to do that. It's not always going to be guaranteed or as consistent because, again, of the issues that Mephisto faces with his healing and having his buffs removed and having that longer iframe ignore. But if you have a good matchup where someone can take that damage, characters like Ghost Rider for example, then you have the capability of actually beating very strong native tier 3 characters like Null and Sentry, and the opponent will also have to face another native tier 3 character on your team, which they might end up struggling with or have the chance of losing if they're using just native tier 2 characters or ones that aren't in the top 5. You saw from that last clip that I was actually able to get around 90 points in Team Battle Arena. Usually you get around 60 unless you can win all of your fights consecutively. And with Mephisto, you have the capability of doing that, being able to take out characters like Null or Sentry where you previously couldn't. This can provide you a huge advantage in Team Battle Arena, allowing you to climb pretty high up and gain more rewards as well as more crystals potentially, especially when the bans remove one of these characters, either Null or Sentry. Mephisto's performance in Otherworld Battle is currently limited, but I can foresee him being useful there as well. Currently, there is a huge penalty where villain characters take 500% more damage, so his survivability won't really be that great, and the showcase won't be that great because he won't survive till the very end, but people are still using him in Otherworld Battle even with that penalty going to some success. When that penalty is removed, I'm pretty sure that he will be useful in certain weeks, especially because the character just leaves a lot of damage on the ground even after he dies and has a lot of lockdown from those skills. That pretty much wraps up this review for Mephisto. In summary, if you're using the character for PvE, a CTP of competition might end up being the most ideal overall, since you get some value if you use him as a hybrid in PvP, and he will be the best performing in ABL. He should be well enough also in World Boss Legend and in ABX as well, but from the testing that I did, you do gain a little bit of extra boost in ABX and in World Boss Legend, but I'm not sure if that'll be enough to kind of compensate the lower score that you get in ABL. So competition might be the most ideal option for him overall in PvE, and in PvP the clear winner ended up being Conquest, but the CTP of Refinement was also a viable option, which usually isn't the case for a lot of characters. Mephisto does have some issues holding him back from being in the top 3 in PvP, namely the longer cooldown on his iframe ignore, as well as his healing skill not really kind of functioning as it should, with it being removed and just not providing enough healing and survivability for him. And for that reason, he is arguably somewhere in the top 6 to 10 range in PvP, but could potentially end up being better. Just there needs to be more testing put in place, but that's kind of my estimate of where he currently lands. Because Mephisto is a native tier 3 character and his high cost, if you try to build him as a dedicated PvP character and expect him to exceed the performance or at least match that of Null and Sentry, you might end up being disappointed. But if you just build him for PvP because you don't really care about PvE that much, then you will get value out of him across some of the PvP modes. But I expect that for his high cost, a lot of people will just want to build him for PvE, since that is kind of what matches that cost and performance comparison. If the devs made the changes that I mentioned, it's very possible that Mephisto will be the strongest character in the game outright, competing at the highest level in PvE and PvP, and will essentially be the true hybrid in the game, where depending on how you build him, he will be at the top of the meta in PvE or PvP. That does it for this one. This was probably the longest video I've ever done and was the most testing I've ever done for a character, just outright testing every CTP. So if you did find it useful or entertaining, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with others. It helps my channel grow and I can make more interesting and entertaining, informative videos like this in the future. As always, I appreciate people taking the time to watch my videos, so thank you. But the video is now finally over.